Here are 7 practical landing tips that I don't think get talked about enough that are not only going to help you improve your landings, but I promise it's going to help you in your confidence. And the first one is to treat landings as a flight maneuver. Emphasis on the word flight here, because we really need to take ownership of the whole process to say, hey, the airplane is still flying, and since I'm pilot in command, I need to put the wheels on the ground when and where I want them. And it's kind of a different approach than the way that a lot of us learn, which is basically just having the airplane land itself through stalling just right above the ground and letting the airplane land itself. But to me, that makes you more of a passenger in the process rather than the pilot in command. So it's kind of a mindset shift first and foremost to say, no, I'm gonna take ownership and realize that this whole thing, including putting the airplanes, the mains, on the ground, it's very much a flight maneuver. Just like you can practice slow flight or turns or all these different flight maneuvers, landing itself is actually a flight maneuver, even though you're ultimately touching the ground. And so to set up this whole flight maneuver, everything comes down to airspeed. And one of the best pieces of advice an instructor ever gave me on this topic is to just continue the mantra through all phases of the landing, say high, low, fast, or slow, and what are you gonna do about it? A lot of times they'll say, oh, we're high and we're fast. Okay, well then what are you actually going to do about it? Really just trying to double down on this idea, like you are in control of everything. You should get to the point where you can make the airplane do exactly what you want. And so airspeed is everything. A lot of us get lazy in this and be like, okay, if we're shooting for 60 knots or whatever, like I do in my 182, it's easy to say, oh, we're going 65, 67, whatever. But the whatever ends up meaning you're probably just gonna land long. You're gonna get down a ground effect and you're just gonna float down the runway. We all see people, like while we're waiting to take off, you can see someone coming in way too hot and you're like, they're gonna touch down halfway down the runway because they're way too fast, right? And so airspeed is everything. And the biggest way that you can control airspeed and like be disciplined with it is to just trim religiously. So this was really pounded into my brain early on as I was learning to fly a Super Cub, just to really trim the airplane out to do exactly what you want it to do. And it's a beautiful thing. And it really goes back to slow flight, which we'll talk about in a minute, to where you were, saying, hey, let's get the airplane at 50 miles an hour and hold it there. And so what do? Well, you end up configuring the airplane and trim it to where you can basically be hands off and the airplane is just going to stay there. And you can do the exact same thing with landing. And so I just really encourage you to be religious about trim. Like if you're at 65 knots, but you should be at 60, you need to give it some trim, give it some nose up trim, let it settle into that airspeed. And everything is like pitch for airspeed, power for altitude. And if you do that religiously, it's just going to work wonders for your landings. Next, I think it's good to remember that the airport that you're learning at, the runway that you're practicing on, is probably enabling you to have a bad habit here. What do I mean by that? Well, my home airport, Addison Airport, it's about 7,000 feet long. And if you're not careful, you can get really spoiled on a 7,000 foot runway, which is really not that big of a deal until you try to go land in more interesting places, like landing in the backcountry. Maybe the airstrip you're landing on is only 2,000 feet, or maybe less. If you're only used to the sight picture of 7,000 foot runways and you're kind of lazy on your approach speeds, you're lazy on your aiming points and stuff, because you're like, hey, I've got 7,000 feet to work with, it's not that big of a deal. That's true, it's not that big of a deal, but it will come back to bite you. And so I'm not perfect at this, but I really try to approach like literally and figuratively, Addison Airport, pretending that it's not 7,000 feet, right? Like, let's pretend that it's a 1,500 foot runway. And you can work up to this. You don't have to if you're day one, don't do this. But you can start to work up to it and say, hey, we're gonna pretend this thing is only 1,500 feet long and we have to hit our spot. We have to have our airspeed under control. And that's going to create much, much better landings to force some constraints. So don't get spoiled on long runways. This next point was really, really eye-opening to me. So I got to do some training and filming with TAC Aero, which is an elite flight school, just awesome guys, awesome pilots here in Texas. And they specialize in landing in really short places. They do seaplane stuff, like all the best parts of aviation they train. I got to fly with them for a few days leading up to landing on this sandbar, which I'd never done before. And in warm up for that, we were on this longer grass runway, it's like 3,000 feet or so. And we were trying to just work on spot landings. And so we did it over and over and over, trying to land in 3-point configuration in a tail dragger and nailing the spot. And as you can see with the footage on the screen, I kept floating past the spot and floating past the spot. And it wasn't obvious to me till I went back and put the video together. I was like, oh my gosh, we had this aiming point and I was making the mistake of aiming for the aiming point. Which is well, yeah, it's an aiming point. But the trick is to one, have an aiming point on the runway. And two, if you have a spot you're trying to aim by, you gotta aim short of that aiming point because you gotta factor in the flare and some ground effect and things. So if you're saying, hey, I wanna land right on the 1,000 foot markers, Don't stare at that and try to fly to it, because what will happen is you'll get down there and you're gonna float right past it. So you have to aim short of that point. I'll be honest, like most times when I'm landing on a long runway, like I kind of know generally where I'm approaching and kind of what I'm aiming for, but like when you touch down is when you touch down. And it's not that big of a deal because you have a lot of room. But I promise, once you start trying to land shorter, like you don't have that kind of margin to try to just aim and like end up on the runway somewhere. And I'm guilty of this. Like I've got almost 1,200 hours and I'm still trying to like get good at this skill. So try this the next time you fly. Try landing with a very specific aiming point. Don't just say, well, I'll generally touch down around the numbers, around the 1,000-foot markers. Say, no, I want to touch down exactly on the 1,000-foot markers, nothing before. And so that can be your aiming point. And then make sure you aim short of that aiming point. So that way you can factor in your flare and ground effect and things. So you can actually really try to touch down with your mains exactly where you want them. Now, this next tip is my favorite and maybe the most powerful one. But real quick, I wanted to let you know about a new free resource I spent a few weeks making. And it's a huge PDF that features 88 different takeaways that I have learned in my years of flying. It's all the lessons I've learned, the things that I've messed up, the things that thankfully I've done well, with really, really skimmable takeaways. It's in a different color so you can skim the document and see what I've learned that can hopefully help you in your flying journey. So you can grab that totally free over at airplaneacademy.com/takeaways. The link is also down in the description. One thing that can make landing really hard to master is that you're really not in the actual landing part for very long at all. Like most of our flight is either en route, you're way up high, or you're on the ground. Like that moment that you're in ground effect and actually touching down and stuff, you're there for like such a tiny fraction of time that it's hard to get the muscle memory of that. And so one exercise that can really, really help with this is to basically fly the length of the runway in ground effect. You're only gonna be flying a few feet off of the ground, but you're gonna be feeling what the airplane feels like with that level of buoyancy. And it's gonna be a lot different than what the approach feels like or what cruise feels like. And so you can fly down the runway. I do this sometimes if I'm gonna land long because I'm going to, get fuel at the other end of the runway or something. You can fly down a safe amount of the runway, give yourself plenty of margin, and just hover there, basically in ground effect. It's good to practice. It's good to build some time in that sight picture, and then touch down, farther down the runway than you normally would. Or you can exercise a go around, come back and do it again. And just building that muscle memory and that comfort level of being near the ground and seeing things go by, and also building a sense for how high off the ground you are, will help you so much that way. Because like otherwise, when you're coming in, everything, beneath 20 or 50 feet above the ground happens in an instant. It's minuscule. And that's the most important part, where everything comes together. So why not hang out in that configuration for a little while and build some comfort level with it? And this can end up being helpful in a lot of sneaky ways. Like if you ever fly into Oshkosh, sometimes you might be flying down the runway until they tell you to land on that green dot or whatever. And if you want to be able to do all the things that I just mentioned, there's one maneuver in particular that I promise will help all of those things. And that's getting really, really good at slow flight. And flying slow enough really is the foundation for all of this. Like it's going to make your landings better, because if you're always coming in too fast, like you're always going to get spoiled on long runways because you're not going to be capable of landing short. You're never going to be able to do any sort of spot landing because you're always just going to float right past it. Like we have to get comfortable flying slow. And so practicing slow flight, even when you're up at 5,000 feet or whatever, is going to get you more time in that feeling of not having excess energy in the plane. And really landing well all comes down to energy management. And slow flight is one of the best exercises there is at getting better at energy management. And one word of encouragement I want to put in here: all of this stuff is doable with practice. I know there are some of you watching right now that like, you just don't feel like you've got landings and you're not sure if you're ever going to be able to really get landings and be comfortable with it solo. But I promise, like I've been doing this for a long time. I promise, if I could just shake you, like I promise this will come with practice. Give yourself time. Like think about how difficult it was to learn how to drive a car on the highway, right? Like that was really intimidating, and now you can do it in your sleep. Flying is more challenging than that, but it's the same thing. Like your brain will learn the muscle memory if you stick with it and just be patient. So try to give yourself some grace and hang in there. And probably the best training I've ever had in energy management is in the footage that you're looking on the screen. I got to fly with TAC Aero to land on a sandbar. And so we landed at progressively shorter and shorter airstrips, trying to get comfortable landing really short here. And I learned so much about landing, and I summarize all of it in the video on the screen. I think this can also help make your landings better. So I'll see you there.